Amora arrived at the gates of Nyanda Primary School early one Monday morning. Her small frame was hidden beneath a faded blue uniform, and her books were neatly tied with a frayed string. The children playing in the schoolyard stopped and stared at her as she walked past. There was something about her that made people pause, a quietness that felt out of place in the boisterous schoolyard. Her skin was smooth and pale, and her large, piercing eyes seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight. The teacher, Mr. Juma, introduced her to the class. "This is Amora. She's new to our school, and I expect you all to treat her kindly," he said with his usual stern tone. Amora stood at the front of the room, her gaze steady and unreadable. The students murmured among themselves as she walked to an empty desk at the back of the classroom. From the moment she sat down, Amora became the subject of whispers. "She looks strange," one girl said to her friend. "Did you see her eyes?" another boy added. Mumby, the self-proclaimed leader of the class, smirked as she watched Amora. To her, Amora was an easy target, a quiet, odd girl who wouldn't fight back. During break time, the children gathered in groups to eat and talk, but Amora sat alone under a large baobab tree. She unwrapped her small piece of bread and ate slowly, her eyes scanning the playground. Mumby and her friends approached her, pretending to be friendly. "Why are you sitting here alone?" Mumby asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "I like it here," Amora replied softly, not looking up. Mumby snatched the bread from Amora's hands and took a bite. Her friends laughed loudly, but Amora simply stared at Mumby. For a moment, Mumby felt a chill run down her spine. There was something unsettling about the way Amora looked at her, but she quickly shook it off. "What's wrong? Can't you speak?" Mumby taunted, tossing the bread on the ground. Amora said nothing. She picked up the bread, dusted it off, and continued eating. The bullying continued over the next few days. Mumby and her friends would trip Amora in the corridors, hide her books, and call her names. Amora never reacted. She would quietly pick up her things and move on as if nothing had happened. Her calmness irritated Mumby. "She thinks she's better than us," Mumby told her friends. "We'll teach her a lesson." One afternoon, Mumby devised a plan to humiliate Amora. She waited until the class was empty and then spilled ink all over Amora's desk. When Amora returned, Mumby stood nearby, pretending to look innocent. "Oh no, your desk is ruined," Mumby said with fake concern. Amora looked at the desk, then at Mumby. Her expression didn't change, but her voice was firm as she said, "Be careful, Mumby. You don't know what you're doing." Mumby laughed. "What are you going to do? Stare at me?" she mocked, but deep inside, she felt uneasy. There was something about Amora's voice that made her feel small and powerless. The next day, strange things began to happen. Mumby's chair broke as soon as she sat on it, even though it had been fine moments before. Another bully, Zola, felt something slither past her legs in the classroom, but when she looked down, there was nothing there. The other students began to notice, too. Amora's cursed, one boy whispered to his friend. Strange things happen around her. Amora remained silent through it all. She continued to sit under the baobab tree, eat her bread, and watch the playground with her piercing eyes. The whispers grew louder, but no one dared to confront her directly. Even Mumby began to feel a twinge of fear, though she would never admit it. By the end of the week, everyone in the school had an opinion about Amora. Some thought she was strange but harmless, while others believed she was hiding something dark. As for Amora, she seemed completely unbothered by the rumors. She walked through the school as quietly as she had on her first day, her presence both unsettling and intriguing. But deep down, everyone knew something wasn't right. And for the first time, Mumby began to wonder if she had made a mistake. The bullying escalated over the next few weeks. Mumby and her group, emboldened by the laughter of their classmates, took every opportunity to torment Amora. They called her cruel names, hid her books, and spilled water on her chair before she sat down. Amora never retaliated. She would simply clean herself up, retrieve her belongings, or move to another seat without saying a word. Her silence only made Mumby more determined to break her. One rainy afternoon, Mumby came up with a new plan. "Let's lock her in the storeroom after class," she whispered to her friends during lunch. "Let's see how calm she stays then." Zola and Pendo hesitated. "Are you sure about this? What if we get caught?" Pendo asked nervously. "No one will know," Mumby snapped. "Besides, she deserves it. She acts like she's too good for everyone." That evening, as the other students rushed to leave before the rain got heavier, Mumby and her friends cornered Amora in the hallway. "Amora," Mumby said sweetly, "can you help us carry some books to the storeroom? It's just down the hall." Amora looked at her with those steady, piercing eyes. For a moment, Mumby thought Amora might refuse, but she nodded and followed them. When they reached the storeroom, Mumby gestured for Amora to go inside. "The books are on the shelf at the back," she said. As soon as Amora stepped inside, Mumby slammed the door shut and locked it. She and her friends burst into laughter, their voices echoing in the empty hallway. "Let's see how you like spending the night here," Mumby shouted through the door. Inside the storeroom, Amora didn't panic. She stood silently in the darkness, her eyes glowing faintly. She could hear the girls laughing outside, their voices fading as they ran off. She whispered softly to herself, her words inaudible but chilling in the stillness. The next morning, the storeroom door was wide open, and Amora was sitting at her desk as though nothing had happened. Mumby and her friends exchanged nervous glances. "How did she get out?" Zola whispered. "We locked the door." Mumby brushed it off. "Maybe the janitor opened it." "Stop worrying." But deep down, she felt uneasy. Amora's calmness was unnerving. It was as if nothing they did could shake her. That day, something strange happened. Zola, one of Mumby's closest friends, stayed late after school to finish her homework. The classroom was empty, and the sound of the rain outside made the room feel colder than usual. As Zola packed her bag, she heard a faint hissing sound. She froze, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The hissing grew louder, and she felt something cold brush against her ankle. She screamed and ran out of the classroom, leaving her bag behind. The next morning, Zola didn't come to school. "Maybe she's sick," Mumby said, trying to hide her unease. But when another one of her friends, Pendo, disappeared a few days later, the whispers began. "It's Amora," one boy said during recess. "She's doing something to them." "That's ridiculous," Mumby snapped when she overheard. But even she couldn't ignore the fear creeping into her thoughts. Everywhere she went, it felt like Amora's piercing eyes were watching her. One afternoon, Mumby decided to confront Amora. "What did you do to Zola and Pendo?" she demanded, blocking Amora's path as she walked to class. Amora stopped and looked at her, her expression unreadable. "I told you to be careful," she said softly. Mumby felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice faltering. Amora didn't answer. She simply walked past Mumby and into the classroom. That night, Mumby couldn't sleep. She kept hearing faint hissing sounds outside her window and seeing shadows that looked like snakes slithering across her walls. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of Amora's glowing eyes staring at her in the darkness. The next day, Mumby was on edge. She stayed close to the teachers and avoided being alone. But as the day went on, she began to feel more confident. "This is silly," she told herself. "She's just a weird girl. She can't do anything to me." But deep down, she knew something was coming. And it was only a matter of time. The air in Nyanda Primary School was thick with unease. Two of Mumby's closest friends had disappeared, and the rumors about Amora had spread like wildfire. Some students avoided her entirely, afraid of what might happen if they got too close. Others whispered stories about her in hushed tones, claiming she was a witch, a cursed spirit, or something far worse. Through it all, Amora remained the same, silent, calm, and unnervingly composed. Mumby, however, refused to back down. Despite the fear creeping into her heart, she couldn't let anyone see her weakness. She walked through the school with her head held high, pretending not to notice the uneasy glances from her classmates or the strange silence that seemed to follow Amora wherever she went. One afternoon, as the class was dismissed, Mumby found herself alone in the hallway. She had stayed behind to collect her books, but as she turned to leave, she heard a faint hissing sound. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The hissing grew louder, echoing through the empty hallway. Mumby's eyes darted around, but she saw nothing. She clutched her books tightly and started walking quickly toward the exit. But the sound followed her, growing louder with every step. She broke into a run, her heart pounding. As she turned a corner, she collided with someone and let out a scream. It was Mr. Juma. "Mumby, what's wrong?" he asked, his face filled with concern. I thought I heard something," she stammered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Mr. Juma frowned. "It's probably just your imagination. Go home and try to get some rest." Mumby nodded, but as she walked out of the school gates, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. That night, Mumby locked her bedroom door and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that the strange noises were just in her head. But as she closed her eyes, she heard it again, the same hissing sound, faint but unmistakable. She sat up, her heart racing. The sound was coming from outside her window. Slowly, she turned her head and saw a shadow slithering across the glass. It was long and thin, like a snake, and it moved with an unnatural grace. Mumby screamed and scrambled out of bed, but when she turned back to the window, the shadow was gone. She spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner of her room, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, she arrived at school looking pale and exhausted. Her classmates noticed immediately. "What's wrong with her?" one boy whispered to another. Amora, sitting under the baobab tree as usual, glanced at Mumby but said nothing. Mumby avoided her gaze, her fear now almost overwhelming. By lunchtime, Mumby couldn't take it anymore. She marched over to Amora, her hands trembling but her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the other students. "What did you do to Zola and Pendo?" she demanded. Amora looked up at her, her piercing eyes calm and steady. "I warned you," she said softly. "But you didn't listen." "What does that mean?" Mumby shouted, her voice cracking. "Where are they?" Amora stood slowly, and the crowd of students backed away, their fear palpable. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, her voice as cold as the wind that suddenly swept through the playground. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mumby stayed at school longer than usual, trying to finish her homework. The classroom was eerily quiet, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. As she packed her bag to leave, she heard the hissing again. This time, it was louder and closer. She turned around, and her blood ran cold. Amora was standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Amora," Mumby whispered, her voice barely audible. Amora stepped forward, her movements smooth and deliberate. "You've hurt me for too long," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Now it's time for you to feel what I felt." Before Mumby could respond, Amora's body began to change. Her arms lengthened, her legs fused together, and her skin shimmered like scales. In moments, she had transformed into a massive snake, her body coiling around the classroom. Mumby screamed, but it was no use. The snake lunged at her, and everything went dark. The next morning, the students and teachers found the classroom empty. Mumby was gone, just like Zola and Pendo. Amora, too, was nowhere to be found. Her desk was empty, and no one had seen her leave. The village buzzed with rumors for weeks. Some said Amora was a spirit sent to punish the cruel. Others believed she was a snake goddess in disguise. But no one ever saw her again. From that day on, the students at Nyanda Primary School treated each other with kindness and respect, fearing the return of the girl with the piercing eyes. And under the old baobab tree, where Amora used to sit, the children sometimes swore they could hear faint hissing, a reminder of the girl who disappeared without a trace.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories.